Max, we're going to continue our series of Postmortem reports where we're going to break down what went right, what went wrong for every college football team in the state. We've moved on to two Big 12 rivals. We will start with the TCU Horned Frogs. TCU goes 6-7. Is that correct?
Yes.
That sounds right.
6-6 and then lost in the bowl game?
I believe that's correct. Let me make sure I got that right. Yeah, they go 6-7.
Yeah.
And so, on one hand, you make it to a bowl game, but on the other hand, I don't think there's any TCU fan who's particularly pleased with how this went.
Yeah, not the way the last few years have gone.
Exactly. So, TCU goes 6-7. They do make a bowl game, but things don't go as great as possible. So, let's talk about first, let's be positive, what went right. And overall, from a general perspective, the defense was pretty good. I think the defense was pretty good, especially the pass defense. It was kind of middle of the road in the 40s nationally.
I don't think it took the leap we thought it would, obviously. But
yeah,
passable.
And in the bigger,
average.
Yeah, exactly. I would say it was slightly above average.
Slightly, yeah.
They gave up. They were in like the 60s and the 50s on the big stats like points per game and yards per game allowed and stuff like that. And really, the other thing that is that from the offensive perspective, they were a little bit above average as well.
Yeah.
And I feel like TCU fans are going to say, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. But the numbers bear it out. For example, they ran the ball pretty well. 31st in the nation, 5.1 yards per carry. They threw the ball adequately. It wasn't good enough, but it was okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest thing is that they generally took care of the football. They did give it away, 1.5 times per game, but you can live with that. With that. Generally speaking, they were pretty good on both sides of the ball. They were adequate, but what really got them, and now we'll get into what went wrong, were in the margins. So, for example, you could generally tell when I said, they were pretty good running the ball, 5 yards a carry. You would take 5 yards a carry.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't uniformly 5 yards a carry. And you could tell pretty early in pretty much every TCU game whether or not they were going to win that game based on how well they were running the ball.
Yeah.
Okay? In their get this. So they ran the ball 488 times. Okay? 488 times.
Yeah.
Literally, exactly, 244 runs in their 6 wins and 244 runs in their 7 losses.
Yeah.
Literally broken down exactly. They ran the ball an equal amount in their wins and their losses. Now, obviously, there was one extra loss, but you get that. Here's the difference. In their wins, they averaged 6.1 yards per carry, had 250 yards on the ground per game. In their losses, 4.2 yards per carry.
Okay, all right. So solid 2 yards there.
There's a big difference between if they were able to run the ball, things were going okay. If they weren't able to run the ball, things generally weren't.
This supports sort of the anecdotal thing that I think we all noticed. This is a wildly inconsistent team.
Yes.
Right. So you would get a very different team, not just game to game, but quarter to quarter.
The TCU team that won games, was wildly different from the TCU team that lost games. That the TCU, and even in, I don't even want to put it all on that because that's
It's too simple.
That's judging by the destination as opposed to the journey. That there were some games, for example, their win over Arkansas, or their game against Arkansas. People feel like they probably should have won that game, and they played pretty well. But then you look at their game against Tech, and they played terrible. Their defense played okay. The defense was terrible. Their game against Oklahoma State, they were terrible. Kansas State, they were terrible. They were, but then again, they lose by 6 to Oklahoma, who ends up being probably the best. They end up being the Big 12 champion.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. And so when you talk about what went wrong, here's another thing. They were real bad at home. They were 2-5 at home.
Yeah.
2-5 at home.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing that if you say what went wrong is that unlike the halcyon days of TCU and Gary Patterson TCU teams, this team did not take the ball away as much. They only averaged 1.2 takeaways per game. That's 97th in the nation. And for TCU, generally speaking, TCU's great defenses have been big play defenses.
Right.
They haven't necessarily shut you down for 4 quarters, but they will come up with 2 or 3 real big plays.
Right.
The bottom line is they didn't do that. Now they got after the quarterback. Their sack percentage was pretty good, but they did not take the ball away. They did not force a ton of fumbles. They only, they had the 95th best interception percentage in the nation. So that's a very and there's some teams that would take that. TCU, though, is really dependent on that. And so when you look at what went wrong, I think the biggest thing comes back to the fact that they didn't win the margins. They didn't win with the big play, and they were bad on third down defensively, too.
And there's some fine margins here, too, right? You can see a couple of these games going the other way, and you go, well, it wasn't a great year, but it wasn't a bad year.
That's exactly
either.
right.
The Arkansas game's a great example.
I think TCU overall was a pretty good team that lost the little things, is what happened.
Yeah.
And so if you're naming a team MVP, I think it's got to come from the defense, and I think that it would either be Josh Carraway, who had a good year, who was their best pass rusher, or Traven Howard at the linebacker spot.
Yeah.
Either of those guys, I probably want to split co-MVPs because really, the defense was relatively consistent. Was it consistently excellent? No, I wouldn't say that. But it was relatively consistent.
Sure.
The offense was wildly inconsistent. We haven't even mentioned one guy's name.
Yeah.
We haven't even mentioned the name of Kenny Hill.
Yeah.
Kenny Hill, I think, gets a little too much of the blame for what happened now that I'm kind of digging in the numbers because basically, now I don't think he was good, and I think Kenny Hill would admit that he wasn't good this year, at least consistently good. But the bottom line is I think that had a lot more to do with whether or not they were able to run the ball.
Yeah.
As opposed to...
I think, look, there were a lot of situations where it was up to him to save the game, and it didn't always go well.
Right.
And that's not necessarily on him.
Right. He should have never been put in that position. So, if you look at 2017, look, they're going to bring back Kenny Hill. It's probably his job until he loses. It's his job to lose, basically. Yeah. They are bringing back, if you're looking for very good news, they're bringing back 4 of the 5 offensive linemen.
It's good.
They're bringing back almost every receiver. They're bringing back Kyle Hicks. They're bringing back a number of great running backs.
Yep.
The defense will need to overcome some losses. They're losing Josh Carraway. They're losing 3 of their front 4. But they are bringing back Traven Howard. They're losing Denzel Johnson in the secondary. Overall, expectations are going to be, in my view, rightfully high for TCU next year. Now, how do they overcome losing Doug Meacham? That's another instance. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think it's all relative, too, right? Because what we keep talking about, we don't really know. The Big 12, other than Oklahoma, is going to be kind of wiped out this year. And who's going to rise up? TCU seems like they're in a better position than most.
TCU, but again, a lot of it's going to come back to, can they run the ball?
Yeah.
And can Kenny Hill be a viable threat through the air, consistent threat through the air? That's basically it. So.